So we begin with mode of exchange, or we pick up with mode of exchange. Essentially, a mode of exchange is that aspect of the economic system that describes the dominant pattern of transferring goods, services, etc., between and among people and groups. Between and among people and groups means that it's a system where goods and services are exchanged between individuals within a society, and they're also exchanged between whole entire groups, even entire societies. These modes of exchange can vary from something that looks like simple gift giving, which we're more or less going to call generalized reciprocity, all the way up to things like market societies, and a market society would be an example of a unbalanced system of exchange. And we'll explain what that means a little bit later on. The anthropologist Marshall Solon said that social distance determines what kind of reciprocity will be used in a society. Now, when he talked about social distance, he meant the level of intimacy between people. I know that we're going through this quarantine stuff, and you've been told to practice social distancing, but that's not what Marshall Solomons meant by social distancing. What he meant by social distance was more or less the level of familiarity between people, the level of intimacy between people, and it's that level of intimacy, whether they are very intimate or whether they are, for example, strangers, that's going to determine the kind of reciprocity that they will be engaged in a society. Before we get into the difference between generalized reciprocity and negative reciprocity and all those other things, the first issue that Barbara Miller brings up is the issue of the pure gift. And you'll notice here that I have it with a question mark after it. And the reason for that is because whether or not there is actually such a thing as a pure gift is a matter of some debate among anthropologists. It was first discussed by an anthropologist of the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century, named Marcel Mauss, M-A-U-S. And he wrote a book called The Gift. And this book was about systems of exchange in various societies. So a pure gift is defined technically as something that is given with no thought of a return. We give it and we do not think about or concern ourselves about whether or not we will be receiving a return. So it is an extreme form of what we are going to call on the next slide generalized reciprocity. And again, there's a debate over whether or not there's such a thing as a pure gift. Do people give things with absolutely no expectation of a return of any kind? And I have these pictures you'll see on the slide, these pictures, because there are those that argue that parental care of children is actually a pure gift. Do parents spend resources on their children with no intent of a return? Even if parents do not calculate costs, do they still have expectations about what their children will return to them, or even what their children should return to them? Not simply a material return, but the return doesn't have to be material. It can be immaterial, or it can be, in other words, symbolic. What do parents believe their children owe them, for example, for the care that they give? Okay, well, now we move on to generalized reciprocity. Let me get my notes here going. And we had that quote from Marshall Solomons, who said that social distance determines the kind of reciprocity that's used between people entering an exchange. Generalized reciprocity is the main form of exchange between people who know and trust each other. In generalized reciprocity, people exchange goods and don't expect a return at any definite time in the future. So they give you something and they expect a return, but not at any particular time in the future, no definitive time in the future, and people don't keep track of the exact value of the items that they're exchanging. They're simply exchanging items. On the chart that I gave you, I described some transactions as moral transactions and others as mechanical transactions. And that's what we can talk about next. Generalized reciprocity is a very good example of exchange as a moral transaction, not a mechanical transaction. And when we call an exchange a moral transaction, we mean that the purpose of that exchange is not simply to exchange some kind of good, but that the purpose of the exchange is to establish and to maintain human relationships, right? To establish and to maintain personal relationships between individuals and groups. One of the examples I have of that is if you've ever been to a bar, I know some of you have, and you're sitting down with your friend and you order a couple of drinks and you pick up the tab for the first round. So you do the first round, I get the first round, and then you order another round and your friend gets the next round, and you do that back and forth. You are exchanging goods. But what's the point, right? What's the point of that? Why don't you both just spend your own money? And the point is because it isn't just about the drinks. It isn't just about exchanging the drinks. This is something that friends do. And so buying rounds for each other is cementing or reinforcing your friendship. When we talk about a mechanical transaction, we mean transactions that are primarily all about simply the exchange of goods. And these can be exchanges that take place between strangers. An example of a moral transaction and an example of this idea of generalized reciprocity is the Kung custom of Exaro. I mentioned it before. One of the articles that you've been assigned to read is by Kronk, called Reciprocity and the Power of Giving. In that article, he is talking about the Kung custom of Exaro, and he has a description of it. And he says, after deciding the proper time for a response, a recipient must consider how to make repayment, and that is dictated largely by the motive behind the gift. Some exchange customs are designed solely to preserve a relationship. The Kung have a system called Exaro, in which little attention is paid to whether the items exchanged are equivalent. Richard Lee's informant, Zoma, explained to him that, quote, Exaro is when I take a thing of value and give it to you. Later, much later, when you find some good thing, you give it back to me. When I find something good, I give it to you, and so we will pass the years together. When Lee tried to determine the exact exchange values of various items, is a spear worth 3 strings of beads, 2 strings, or 1, Zoma explained that any return would be all right. Zoma said, you see, we don't trade with things, we trade with people. So Zoma's quote there about how we don't trade with things, we trade with people is a good example of what we mean when we say that the purpose of the exchange isn't simply to exchange items. The motivation behind the exchange simply isn't to exchange items. The motivation behind the exchange is to cement a relationship. And we move from generalized reciprocity to something called balanced reciprocity. So if you think about generalized reciprocity, just to review a little bit, we're exchanging something, say we're entering an exchange, and we're not really caring, right? Either of us are not really caring about, first of all, the value of the thing we're exchanging and the value of the thing we're going to get back. And we're not really caring about whether or not, we're not really caring, I should say, about the time frame, right, within which that return will be made. Balanced reciprocity also occurs between people who are more or less intimate with each other, but it is an exchange of goods, right? An exchange of services of a specified value. So in other words, in balanced reciprocity, when I give you something, what I expect is something back that's going to be of roughly equivalent value. And that I'm going to be getting this thing back within some culturally defined appropriate length of time. So I have here a picture of some people having a dinner party. And this is what happens very often. So if I invite you to my house for dinner, then I will expect at some point that you will invite me to your house for dinner. And that you're going to do that, right, within a culturally appropriate length of time. If I invited you to dinner and then I found out later on that you had a dinner party at your house and didn't invite me, I might be a little bit offended by that. You see what I'm saying here about balanced reciprocity. We're exchanging goods. The goods that we're exchanging are going to be a roughly equivalent value, a dinner for a dinner, and we're going to do that within some kind of culturally appropriate length of time. The next thing we would talk about here would be redistribution systems. Well, redistribution systems are systems where within a society resources are collected somehow. These resources are collected from individuals and they are pooled together and then they are allocated back out and distributed by some central authority. So I have some illustrations of that down here. So you see the little red dots are people, individuals, their individual households, and they are sending resources, maybe money, right, or maybe goods, to a political authority who gathers them all together and then redistributes them. So we have that now, right? We have, for example, the Social Security system. The Social Security system is a system of redistribution. We pay money, right? Part of our paychecks, goes into the Social Security system with the idea that we pay into it, and then, when we reach whatever age it is, 65 or whatever, when we become eligible, we start to get that money back. We start to pick up our Social Security checks. And that's a system of redistribution. So, even modern states maintain systems of redistribution. I have another picture here of, ancient Incan society had a system of redistribution where people pay taxes. But they didn't pay taxes in money and they didn't pay taxes in kind. They paid their taxes through labor service. And then, the goods that they produced were redistributed back. They were collected by the central authority and then redistributed back to households. So the question in these redistribution systems is who should provide the resources and then how should they be expended? I think I mentioned before potlatching. When we were talking about Ruth Benedict, I talked about potlatching. Potlatching is another system of circulation of goods. And it's a system of circulation of goods that's really based on competitive feasting. Again, remember we were talking about Ruth Benedict, and she was describing the Inuit and their system of potlatching. Now, I have this quote here from an anthropologist named Nancy Bonvillain. You're going to be hearing from her a couple of times as we move through all this. And Nancy Bonvillain defined potlatching as a ceremonial feast characteristic of indigenous Pacific Northwest coast societies, during which hosts distributed to guests a great deal of food and goods that had been accumulated over many months or years. Well, potlatching definitely is or was a really big deal in the Pacific Northwest, but it was also used in other places as well. Cronk, in fact, back in the article Reciprocity and the Power of Giving, talks about potlatching and gift giving as surrogate warfare. So I want to read from him. Okay, I'm going to see where he talks about this. So here is Cronk describing this custom of potlatch and how it came to be a surrogate for warfare. So he said, in the 1880s, after the Canadian government began to suppress warfare between tribes, potlatching also became a substitute for battle. As a Kwakiutl man once said to the anthropologist Franz Boas, quote, "The time of fighting is past. We do not fight now with weapons. We fight with property." End quote. The usual Kwakiutl word for potlatch was pisa, meaning to flatten, as when one flattens a rival under a pile of blankets. And the prospect of being given a large gift engendered real fear. Still, the Kwakiutl seemed to prefer the new war of wealth to the old war of blood. To continue, Cronk said, gift giving has served as a substitute for war in other societies as well. Among the Siuai of the Solomon Islands, guests at feasts are referred to as attackers, while hosts are defenders, and invitations to feasts are given on short notice in the manner of surprise attacks. And like the Kwakiutl of British Columbia, the Mount Hagen tribes of New Guinea use a system of gift-giving called mocha as a way of gaining prestige and shaming rivals. The goal is to become a tribal leader, a big man. One mocha gift in the 1970s consisted of several hundred pigs, thousands of dollars in cash, some cows and wild birds, a truck, and a motorbike. The donor, quite pleased with himself, said to the recipient, "I have won. I have knocked you down by giving so much." So that is going to bring us to the end of part 3, and we just have here one final picture of potlatch on the right, one from the late 19th century. On the left, one from today. So this custom still goes on. And if you study that picture on the right, or excuse me, if you study that picture on the left, try to see what kinds of things people are exchanging in this potlatch.